There's a wall in the Nevada desert holding back so much water it could bury the entire state of Connecticut 10 feet deep. At the very bottom of that wall, the pressure pushing against the concrete is over 300 pounds on every single square inch. And it has stood there, holding all of that back for 90 years without breaking. Now look at it closely, look at the shape. Hoover Dam is 660 feet thick at its base. That's 2 football fields laid end to end, and it tapers up to just 45 feet thick at the top. It's a wedge. And here's the part almost nobody notices. It's curved. The whole structure bows outward, toward the water, like a drawn bow. Which is strange, isn't it? If your only job is to hold back a push, you build a wall. A flat, strong, heavy wall. So why bend it? Why the wedge? And why, with that much pressure leaning on it every second of every day for nearly a century, hasn't the water simply won? The reason it doesn't break is not the reason you'd guess. Because here's what most people quietly assume. They picture the dam as a brute, a slab of concrete so massive and so heavy that it just refuses to budge. And they imagine that if it ever fails, it'll be the water cracking the face, splitting the concrete, crushing its way through. But that almost never happens. Concrete dams, the big ones, hardly ever fail by having their face crushed in. That's one of the rarest ways for a dam to die. The water leaning on the front is not really the threat, which should make you pause, because if the obvious danger isn't the danger, then we've been picturing this whole thing wrong. So what is that curve actually doing? And what is the dam really fighting? Start with the real job. A dam's task isn't simply to be a strong enough wall. Its task is to take an enormous force, one that gets heavier the deeper you go, because water pressure stacks up with depth, and send that force somewhere it can't do any damage. All while not tearing itself apart in the process. And that word, tearing, matters, because concrete has a split personality. Squeeze it, and it's astonishingly strong. You can pile mountains on top of it. But pull it, stretch it, try to bend it apart, and it's weak. It cracks. So whoever designed this wall faced one non-negotiable rule. Keep the concrete squeezed. Never let the water put it into a stretch. Get that wrong, and it doesn't matter how heavy your wall is. So where does all that force actually go? Well, first, let's see why the obvious answer falls short. The simple solution is the brute. Just build a straight wall heavy enough that the water can't shove it or tip it over, and you can do that. But you'd need a truly absurd amount of material, and even then, you still haven't solved the 2 things that actually kill dams, because the real enemies don't attack the front. They come from underneath and from above. From underneath, water is sneaky. It doesn't just press on the face, it works its way down into the rock and tries to seep beneath the dam, building up pressure that literally lifts the structure off its foundation. Engineers call it uplift, and it's exactly as dangerous as it sounds. One of the most famous dam disasters in history, Malpasse in France, gave way because water got into the rock beneath it and pried it loose. The dam didn't get crushed, it got lifted, and from above, overtopping. If the reservoir ever rises higher than the dam and water pours over the top, it claws away at the base on the far side and undermines the whole thing. Across all the dams that have ever failed, going over the top is the single most common cause. Not the face caving in, the water finding a way over or a way under. So a heavy wall alone is a half-finished idea. Hoover Dam had to beat all 3 threats, the push, the lift, and the overflow. And it starts with that curve. This is the part that's genuinely beautiful once you see it. That bow shape isn't decoration, and it isn't an aesthetic flourish. It's an arch lying on its side, bowing into the water. And an arch is one of the oldest tricks in engineering for one reason. It turns a push into a squeeze. When the water leans on a flat wall, it tries to bend it to stretch the back face, exactly the motion concrete hates. But when the water leans on a curved arch, the force gets funneled sideways along the curve and driven straight into the canyon walls on either side. The dam isn't really stopping the water by standing in its way. It's catching that force and handing it off to the solid rock of Black Canyon, and the harder the water pushes, the tighter the arch jams itself into those walls. The river's own strength becomes the thing locking the dam in place. That's why they built it here, in a narrow, steep-walled canyon of hard rock, because the canyon itself is part of the structure. The walls are doing half the work, and the wedge shape does the rest. That massive, thick base sits low and heavy, lowering the dam's center of gravity so it can't tip or slide, and it spreads the load so that the squeeze stays nice and even from top to bottom. 2 systems working at once, the gravity of the weight and the action of the arch. That's why engineers call it an arch gravity dam. It's holding the water with its mass and redirecting it with its shape simultaneously. But here's where it gets even stranger, because the scariest engineering problem in this whole story wasn't holding the water back at all. It was simply pouring the thing. Hoover Dam contains about 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to lay a road from San Francisco to New York. And concrete, as it cures, gives off heat. A lot of heat, from a chemical reaction deep inside the mix. Now, in a sidewalk, that heat escapes in a day. But in a block this colossal, the heat gets trapped in the core with nowhere to go. The engineers ran the numbers and found something almost absurd. If they'd poured it as one solid mass, the inside would have stayed hot for around 125 years. And as it slowly, unevenly cooled, it would have cracked itself apart, long before it ever held a drop of water. The dam would have destroyed itself just by existing. So they got clever. Instead of one giant pour, they built it as a grid of separate interlocking columns, more than 200 of them, fitted together like a colossal set of trapezoidal Lego blocks. And through every one of those blocks, before the concrete went in, they threaded thin steel pipes, nearly 600 miles of pipe in total, buried inside the dam. Then they pumped ice-cold water through all of it, drawing the heat out from the inside, cooled by a refrigeration plant on site that could crank out 1,000 tons of ice a day. Once each block had cooled and shrunk, they pumped grout into the pipes and into the seams between the columns, fusing the whole grid into a single, seamless piece of stone. They didn't just build a dam. They built it so it could survive being built. And the threats from underneath and above? Handled too. To beat the uplift, they drilled deep into the bedrock and injected a curtain of grout to seal off the seeping water, with a drainage system behind it to bleed off any pressure trying to lift the dam. To beat overtopping, they carved 2 enormous spillways into the canyon, set just below the crest, each one able to swallow a flow roughly equal to Niagara Falls and send it harmlessly downstream. The water can never reach the top because long before it does, there's somewhere else for it to go. In fact, the only real scares in the dam's history came from those spillways tearing up under the force of the water, proof that the engineers had their eyes fixed on the right enemies the whole time, never the face. And there's one last quiet detail. That concrete deep inside is still slowly reacting, still hardening. By most accounts, the dam is, ever so slightly, still gaining strength, getting tougher with age. So go back and look at that wall again. It isn't a brute straining against a river, it's a wedge and an arch, calmly taking the weight of a trapped sea and feeding it sideways into a canyon, built to outlast the heat of its own birth, quietly getting stronger every single year. The reason Hoover Dam doesn't break is that it was never really fighting the water at all. It was using it.